At the remainder of the 13 Middos of Rabbi Yishmael. Again, the underlying concept is that these are the tools by which Chazal look at the Torah Shebechsav and derive various halachos from them. Now, the Middos themselves are said to be given to Moshe Sinai and passed down as part of the Torah Shebaal Peh. But remember that the specific laws that are derived from those Middos were not directly given to Moshe. They are Chazal making drashos, and that's why there can be a machlokas. Because again, everyone always asks the question, if all of the oral law was given by Hashem to Moshe, then Hashem said, is it Asur, Mutter, Chayav, Pater, Tamei, Tar? How could there be machloksim? So the Rambam's answer to that is that the methodology was given by Hashem to Moshe. The specific derivations are made by the Chachamim, utilizing Svara, utilizing their logic, and it's Shayach, therefore, the Rambam says, that even if two people have the identical principles, they might apply them in different ways, and that's why it's Shayach a machlokes on halachas that are learned out of a drasha. So what we're going to look at, we probably will not finish it today. Again, it may be helpful if you want to get a Cedar, ArtScroll Cedar, although I have to say, ArtScroll tries to give examples of each of the Yud Gimel Middos, very complicated examples, but some of their examples seem not to be correct, so I'm not going to rely so much on the examples they give.
You said they're not correct?
It seems to me that some of the examples are not correct. In other words, they don't illustrate the principle that they use them for. But that's, one man's opinion. But okay. Anyway, so we're going to look at 8, 9, 10, 11. There are going to be 4 rules here. And the 4 rules start off with the same 4 words. Same 5 words actually. Kol davar shahaya bichlal v'yatsa. That is the beginning of 8, the beginning of 9, the beginning of 10, the beginning of 11. Kol davar shahaya bichlal v'yatsa. And the scenario that these 4 rules are dealing with is the following. The Torah gives you halachos that apply to a general category, and something that would have been within the general category is singled out and treated in a different way. So then there are 4 possible outcomes. Okay, so that's our scenario here. In other words, something was within a general category, v'yatsa, it was then singled out. How do we deal with the singling out of something that was included in a general category? And there are going to be 4 rules dealing with that. Again, hopefully this will become clearer as we give examples of each one. Without examples, it's very, very nebulous. So let's first look at 8, which actually we looked at already, but I'm going to chazer it. Principle 8 says, Kol davar shaya bichlal, anything that was included in a general rule, v'yatsa min haklal, and it was then separated from the general rule, lilamed, to teach me something new. So, lo lilamed al atzmo yatsa, the new thing that it's teaching me is not limited to it alone, ela lilamed al haklal kulo yatsa. Whatever new thing is being taught by the category that's separated out, that new thing is not limited to the thing that was separated out, but it reflects back on the whole klal from which it was taken. I'm pretty sure this doesn't make sense yet, but now let's go over 3 examples illustrating this rule. Illustration 1 is actually from last week's Parsha, Parshas Tzav. We have two halachos dealing with eating kachim when you're tameh. Right? The halacha is if you eat kachim and you're tameh, you're chayav kares. You're chayav kares if you did it on purpose. If you did it b'shogeg, you have to bring a korban. Right? This is called achilas kachim b'tumas haguf. In other words, be sure you understand the difference here. If I eat a korban that became tameh, that is not as severe. The chi of kares is only I eat korbanos when I'm tameh. Okay, so there's a klal. The klal says anyone who eats kachim when they are in a state of tuma is chayav kares. Now that is called a klal because it applies to everything that is sanctified. There is then another pasuk that says anyone who eats a shlamim and is tameh is chayav kares. So that whole pasuk is redundant because shlamim is a davar shahaya bichlal. Shlamim was nichlal in korbanos or kachim. So why was it yatsa min haklal? So the answer is lalame. It got to be teaching me something. And what it's teaching me is not only about shlamim, but it's teaching me something about the whole klal from which shlamim were derived. And here's what the Gemara... Now, the question is, that doesn't tell you what it is. In other words, this just tells you whatever it's coming to teach me is going back to teach me on the whole klal. You understand the problem with the Middos. Now, the Middos don't tell you directly what any case is coming to teach you. That's what Chazal have to decide. But once it's teaching me something, it goes back on the whole klal. So what is it teaching me? Because we have two types of kachim. We have two types of sanctified things. We have kachei mizbeach. We have things that are sanctified for the altar. That's a korban. Chatas, ola, shlamim, asham. That's called kachei mizbeach. But then we have something in which you don't sanctify something for a korban. You sanctify something that can be used for temple maintenance. Let's say you're makdish a bag of cement. Now, a bag of cement is not going to be brought on the mizbeach, but it can be used to repair the building. That's kodshei bedek habayis. Now, even food can be sanctified for bedek habayis. Let's imagine I sanctify something that's not a korban. I sanctify a pound of apples. Or I guess in Israel, say a kilo of apples. Now, apples are not brought on the mizbeach. So what does it mean to sanctify a kilo of apples? Well, that doesn't mean Kohanim can eat it. It's just because, it's bedek habayis doesn't give Kohanim, right? But it means the apples are sold, generating money, and the money is put in the building fund. That's kodshei bedek habayis. Okay? Now, interesting questions in the Gemara. What if I sacrifice an animal that could have been a korban for bedek habayis? In other words, interesting question. In other words, normally we say, if I sanctify animals, they're korbanos. If I sanctify non-animals or animals that are not kosher for a korban, like a chicken, it got to be bedek habayis. What if I took a cow or a goat and I said, I'm not sanctifying this for a korban, I'm sanctifying this for bedek habayis? Can I do that? Can I take something that could have been a korban and sanctify it for bedek habayis? This is discussed in the Gemara, different opinions about it. So I'll let you think about it. So Be'ezus Hashem, you'll learn Maseches Temura and you'll see all the different opinions about it. Okay. So now, if I just had the klal, anyone who eats kachim in tuma is chayav kares, I would have thought that includes anything that's sanctified, whether it's the meat of a korban or a pound of apples. But by mentioning shlamim, now shlamim is a korban, that teaches me something about the klal. Just like shlamim is a korban, and that's why you're chayav a tuma for tuma. So too in the klal, the only kudshim that you're chayav in tuma is kudshay mizbeach and not kudshay bedek habayis. Actually, that example is actually given in the Art Scroll, so that's a good example. And do you see how it fits to the words? Lo l'lamed al atzmo yatsa. It is not coming to teach me something about shlamim, because even if shlamim wouldn't have been mentioned, I would have known that shlamim are within the klal. So there's nothing new about shlamim that this is teaching me. If it wouldn't have said shlamim, I would have known if I eat shlamim betuma, I'm chayiv kares, because that's nichlal and kudshim. So it's not coming to teach me something about shlamim, but it's coming to teach me something about the rule from which shlamim was taken out, i.e., kudshim chayav kares betuma, and it teaches me that rule only applies to kudshay mizbeach. But if you eat kudshay bedek habayis betuma, although you're not allowed to, there's an issue to do it, but you are not chayav kares, and you are not chayav a korban. Now, in this example, it's only teaching me about the klal, and it's not teaching me about itself. Meaning, in this example, the repetition of shlamim teaches me nothing about shlamim that I wouldn't have already known. But now I'll give you another example where it's not only teaching me about the klal, but it's also teaching me something new in the thing itself. And that would be, again, I know this is a little bit of a review, but it's good to go over it. The Torah says in Parshas Mishpatim, Machashefa lo sechaya. A sorceress, a witch, one who practices kishuf, whether it's man or woman actually, gets the death penalty. Okay, but it doesn't tell you which death penalty the person gets, right? There are 4 death penalties of Beis Din. There is skila, which is stoning, which actually means pushing somebody off a cliff. There is serefa, which is burning, which actually means pouring molten metal down the throat. There is hereg, which is decapitation. And there is chenek, that's strangling. So which one? Doesn't say, I don't know. But it then says later, an ov or yidoni. Now these are particular types of sorcery. Basically, they involve either communicating with the dead, that's an ov, who brings up a dead neshama, or yidoni is someone that puts a certain bone in their mouth and somehow, through magic, the bone becomes a prophetic medium, a talking bone, whatever it would be. So it says by ov yidoni, demehem bum, their blood is upon them. Now, Chazal have a shita, how they get that is another question, that whenever it says the phrase demehem bum, it is sekila. So it's ki'ilu, okay, we're not going to go over how we know that, but that's Chazal's Mesorah. So it's ki'ilu, the Torah said, every sorcerer gets the death penalty. That's a klal. It then says, ov and yidoni gets skila. Now, ov and yidoni were already within the category of sorcery, but the Torah separated it out to teach me that not only is there a death penalty, but there's a death penalty of skila. Now, without Midah number 8 rather, I could have said, well, ov and yidoni gets skila. The other ones get some other death penalty. Because I don't have any proof that other types of sorcery get skila. Answer is no. Since ov and yidoni were part of the general category of machashefa, and the Torah separated it out to teach me something new, i.e., that the death penalty is skila, lo lilamed al atzmo yatsa. That is not only coming to teach me about ov and yidoni, elo lilamed al haklal kulo yatsa. It goes back to teach me about the whole generalization, that every type of sorcery, the death penalty is going to be skila. Now, I gave you two examples so far, right? One is the example of shlomim, and the other is the example of ohr.edu machshefa. I hope you can see that there is a subtle difference between these two examples. In the first example, the repetition of shlomim taught me nothing new about shlomim that I wouldn't have known. Had the Torah not said shlomim, I would have known if I eat shlomim betuma am tameh. So in the first example, the purpose of the repetition was only to teach me something about the klal and not to teach me anything about shlomim. Because there's nothing new in shlomim that I wouldn't have known from the klal. In the second example, by contrast, it is teaching me something new even for ohr.edu, because had ohr.edu not been separated out, I wouldn't have known what the punishment is for ohr.edu. So in this case, it is teaching me something about ohr.edu, that it gets skila, but it's not limited to ohr.edu. It's also going back on the klal. So that means there are two ways this midah works. In both of them, whatever it's teaching me is teaching me about the klal, but sometimes it's only teaching me about the klal, and sometimes it is also teaching me about the prat that is mentioned. Now, a very good kasha that one could ask on this midah is, why don't you apply another midah of Rabbi Yishmael, and that is klal uprat? Now, to refresh your memories, klal uprat basically says, if the Torah gave you a general law, and then the Torah said the law applies to specific instances, klal uprat, so we actually say, ein bichlal ela mashe befrat, that the klal only applies to the prat. Now that would mean in the case of shlomim, that if the Torah says a general statement, if you eat kachim betuma, you're chayav kares. And then it says, if you eat shlomim betuma, you're chayav kares. If I would apply klal uprat, you would only be chayav for shlomim, not for other karbanos. Only for shlomim, not for chatas, not for ola. Similarly, by ohr.edu, if the Torah said sorcery is chayav misa, and then says ohr.edu gets skila, if I apply the midah of klal uprat, I don't have a klal. I would say the only sorcery that gets the death penalty is ohr.edu. You understand this? In other words, klal uprat would lead to a different result in both of the examples I gave you. Meaning, when we apply midah number 8, Shlomim teaches me that for any korban, you're chayav kares betuma. But if I applied klal uprat, it would only be shlomim. And in the second example, midah number 8 tells me there's a chayav misa skila for every type of sorcery. But if I would apply klal uprat, there would only be a chayav misa for ohr.edu. Right? So you have a problem when you're given a certain structure of psukim. How do you know to apply this midah versus that midah? Because they're going to be different results, right? Every case, I'll give you a third example, it'd be the same issue. Why don't you apply klal ufrat, which would mean that the halacha only applies to the prat, and there literally is no klal. So again, the Rishonim, there are mefarshim on the Yud Gimel Middos. They ask the question, and the answer they give is that you only apply klal ufrat when the klal and the prat are adjacent to each other. In other words, it would be like, if I give you a pikadon such as A, B, C, D, that's klal uprat. But when you have, like one parsha says a klal, and another parsha has a prat, and they're not really in one listing or one pasuk, you do not apply the rules of klal uprat, but rather you apply the rule of davar shahaya bichlal v'yatsa min haklal lelamed. Yeah.
So why can't it simply say stoning for the other case? Like, why does it have to do this? Like,
oh, okay. That is a very, very excellent question, and that's really a question really in a lot of drushos, and that is if the bottom line is, let's say, that for all kachim betuma you're only chayav kares if it's kachim mizbeach, or every type of sorcery, there is a chi of skila. Why does the Torah write it in such a convoluted way? It writes it as a generalization which you don't know, and then we derive it by a specific example that then goes backwards to redefine the klal. There's an easier way to do this. Simply write in your klal. Write in your klal. Every sorcerer gets skila, instead of leaving it open and then having to fill it in by a prat. Or write in your first pasuk. You're chayav kares only if you eat katshe mizbeach betuma, not if you eat bedek habayis. That is an excellent question, and I'm not really sure if I have an answer. It seems to be HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to create a structure where you need the drashos of Torah Shebal Peh. And then essentially, on a deeper level, your question basically is asking, why aren't things more explicit in the written Torah? Because that's really essentially your question. And in other words, why does Hashem write it in such a way that you need, it's like a code. You need to unlock a code by utilizing certain middos. And part of that is HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to legitimate the methodology of the oral law by writing the Torah in such a way. Meaning the Torah, Hashem did not want everything to be explicit in the written text of the Torah.
Even though it can be so convoluted, it's okay?
Yes, that's part of the process. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted there to be a discovery, a treasure hunt, a discovery process to find out these. But it's a very good question. I mean, I'm not really giving you an answer. I'm just stating what it is that we have. And it is a good question. And as I say, if you generalize the question basically is, what criteria did HaKadosh Baruch Hu use to decide what goes in the text and what is part of an oral tradition? I mean, for example, there are many, many areas of the Torah where the Torah is extremely brief, and the vast majority of your understanding has to come from Torah Shebal Peh. An example actually is Shabbos itself. The Torah does not tell you 39 malachas, right? You learn it out, etc. And then, on the other hand, you look at the laws of leprosy that are coming up. And you have many more psukim devoted to tzaras than you have to Shabbos and Kashrus. So it actually is a mega question or a meta question as to, what are Hashem's cheshbainos in deciding what goes into the text and what is largely left to Torah Shebal Peh. So it is a very profound question, but I don't necessarily have a definitive answer to that. Yeah?
Could you also ask with Rabbi and Miut to ask the same?
It would be the same idea, and that's correct, and it would be the same answer, that it has to be kind of in a listing form, or at least in one parsha. By parsha, by that, I don't mean Cedar of the week. Parsha meaning the paragraph divisions of the Torah. That's what. Remember, you understand this, that the word parsha in Chazal, when Chazal talk about parsha, they do not mean what we mean as parsha. They mean the paragraph divisions, right? If you look in a Sefer Torah or a Tikkun, you will see where paragraphs begin and end, and that's what we mean by a parsha. Yeah.
So the written Torah is very cryptic, but so is the Torah Shebal Peh. So what was if the whole point was to find that the Torah Shebal Peh itself is so cryptic in the Farshim on the Farshim.
Yeah. So again, the concept is, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to be amelim b'Torah. Amelim b'Torah is to toil in Torah, to work in Torah. That things should not be self-evident, things should not be obvious, things should not be 100% clear. We sometimes get frustrated, why are things so confusing? But you have to understand, it's like no pain, no gain. Hashem b'dafka wants to put us into a life, into an existence, where we struggle in the darkness to try to reach the light. And that makes the light much more meaningful than if you were simply giving everything on a silver platter. So that's true for the Torah Shebechsav, and it's true for the Torah Shebal Peh. Again, this brings us back to Rav Chaim Zichrono Livracha, a person who, he was born with many advantages, to be sure, but he was an unstinting miyageya b'Torah, a person who was miyageya b'Torah yomum v'layla mamish, and that's something that we can try to have a little bit of. You had your hand up? Okay. Yep.
Okay.
Okay. Cedar. Let me give you example number 3. Again, we're illustrating klal ches, right? Kol davar shayu b'chlal, v'yotza min ha'klal l'lamed, and this goes back to Hilchei Shabbos. The Torah says in Parshas Vayakel, Lo saseh kol malacha. You are not allowed to do any malacha on Shabbos. Okay. Malacha, we know, includes, although that's the Torah Shebaal Peh, includes 39 malachas. And one of them is fire. Fire is one of the 39 malachas. It then says, explicitly, Lo sivaru eish b'chol moshvoseichem b'yom HaShabbos. Do not burn fire on Shabbos. Now that's superfluous. Even if the Torah wouldn't have said a specific prohibition, do not make fire on Shabbos, I would have known it because the Torah says, don't do malacha. So havara is a davar shahaya bichlal. Havara was already in the category of thou shalt not do malacha. V'yotza min haklal. And the Torah then separates it out and mentions it separately. L'lamed, to teach me something. So again, whatever it is coming to teach me is not only for itself, but it goes back on the klal. Okay. As I say, this doesn't tell you what it's coming, this does not tell you what it's coming to teach you. It's just saying, once you've identified what it's coming to teach you, it'll go back on the klal. So if you remember, this is actually a bit of a complicated drasha. The halacha is if a person is machal, again, and forgive me for chazering, but I think some things could benefit from chazara. Remember, if you're machalol Shabbos b'shaygeg, you're chayav a korban chatas. That's a sin offering. What's a shaygeg? Either I didn't know it was Shabbos, I had the clock wrong, or I thought a given activity was allowed on Shabbos when in fact it was not allowed. Okay, shaygeg. Right, so b'mezid, I'm chayav kares, and if I'm warned by witnesses, the death penalty, skila, b'shaygeg, I'm chayav a korban chatas. So now, here's the question. What if I did different malachos? Let's say I wrote, and I cooked, and I harvested. Now normally, if you do the same avera 3 times, let's say nida, right? If you're bayel and nida, you're chayav v'chatas. So if I was bayel, a woman who's a nida 3 times, I only bring 1 chatas, not 2. Because the same avera 3 times, you only bring 1 chatas. How do you characterize? Now, by Shabbos it'd be the same principle. If I did the same malacha 3 times, kotzer, I'm only chayav 1 chatas. Okay, that's clear. But what if I did 3 different malachos? Kotzer, kosev, bishul. How do you view different malachas? Now, had I just had a klal, don't do malacha, I would have said, kotzer, bishul is doing the same avera twice. Yeah, it's a different malacha, but it's the same lo saseh malacha. So I would have said, if I just had the klal, kotzer, bishul is like kotzer. You're only chayav 1. But by fire, if I was kotzer and started a fire, for sure I would be chayav 2, because fire is mentioned as a separate prohibition. So this is the chiddush. The chiddush that fire is a separate prohibition isn't limited to fire, but it's going back and teaching me every single malacha is treated as a separate prohibition. And therefore, if I'm kotzer and mavashel, I'm chayiv 2. That's called l'chalek, to teach me that each malacha. Now there too, in this example, the chiddush of chiluk is multiple chatais, does apply to the prat as well to the klal. In other words, it's teaching me something about burning. In other words, in the very first example about shlamim, it was not teaching me anything about shlamim. It was only teaching me about the klal. In this case, it's teaching me about burning, but that in turn teaches me about the whole klal. Okay? So we've looked at 3 examples in Midah number 8. The example of Shlomim Betumas Haguf, that teaches me you're only Chayiv Kares for Kadshe Mizbeach and not Kadshe Bedek Habayis. Ohr.edu, that teaches me that every sorcerer, the Chayiv Misa is Skila. And the 3rd example is that every malacha of Shabbos is treated as a different prohibition. So if I did different malachos b'shoigeg, I would be chayav not 1 korban chatas, which would be the case if I did the same malacha. Kaitzer, I'm only chayav 1. But kaitzer, bishul, kosev, I'm chayav 3, because just as havara is a separate negative commandment, we regard every malacha of Shabbos as a separate negative commandment, even though it's all included in Lo Sasa Kol Malacha. These are 3 illustrations of things that are in the klal. The Yotza Min HaKlal, whatever it's coming to teach me, is not only al atzmo, but it's melamed on the whole klal. Okay, very, very important to Midah. One of the things that makes this difficult is that Chazal in the Gemara, so it's mainly in Brises. Most of these drushes are in Brises. Will say things, but they're not going to connect it to a midah. In other words, maybe you'll get sensitized to this. That the Gemara will say, I would think this, Talmud Lomar this, etc. And what the Brises is actually doing is it's using one of these middos, but it doesn't bother to tell you that it's using one of those middos. So a lot of the thing, it's like the old story they tell, this old joke about the guy that didn't know. He heard about poetry and prose, so he figured that only like intellectuals or great writers do poetry and prose. But then he understood that prose just means talking. So he said, I didn't realize I've been speaking prose my whole life. So that's a real fancy thing. I didn't realize I was so intellectual. Well, with the Yud Gimel Middos, lahavdil, a million havdalas, it's kind of the same thing. You didn't know that you were using these Yud Gimel Middos like all the time, because the Brisa will often not tell you that that's what they're doing. But whenever you come across various drushas of psukim, one of these middos, not always, but often one of these middos is going to be used. So davar shahaya bichlal is actually used very often, but it's not mentioned very much. I don't know why exactly. Maybe the assumption was everybody understood the middos, and therefore it didn't have to be pointed out that is the thing that we are doing. Okay, so now let's just start Midah number 9, but we'll finish it tomorrow. Starts off the same way. Kol davar shahaya bichlal, something that was within a general halachic category. Same thing. V'yatza, and it was mentioned separately. Liton toan echad. Now some are goris acher. Actually, echad is makes more sense, so we'll go with echad. And it was singled out. Liton. Now the word liton is to bear, to carry. To carry something. The article has it to discuss a provision of one kind. Okay, but literally, Yatzal liton toan echad, to carry a burden, shehu ke'inyono, that is similar to what is already in the general category. So, let me just start off with the example. I will not be able to even finish this example, but just to introduce it. The problem is the examples themselves are complicated, so you need to know a lot of halachos just to get the example. The Torah devotes, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, a lot of space to the different laws of tsaras. And Parshas Tazria, Parshas Mitzayra are all about Mitzayra. Now there are different types of leprosies. Leprosy is a skin affliction, white, and they have different halachas. There is, no pun intended, plain vanilla tsaras, actually the right color, which is called tsaras or basar. That simply means on your flesh there is a white splotch, and the Kohen has to examine it, and if it's the right size and the right color, the Kohen may paskin it's saras, okay? That's called saras or basar. But after it discusses all the laws of or basar, it then has another parsha of saras that comes after a burn or after a wound. In other words, sometimes, apparently, what happened was, when saras existed, after a burn and a blister, there came a saras condition. Again, it's from Hashem. This is not a medical issue. This is a spiritual issue. And that's called mikveh. Mikveh is saras that comes on your flesh after the burn. And shechin is saras that comes on your flesh after a bruise. And there are certain halachas there. Now, in many ways, the parsha of shechin and mikveh are superfluous parshios, because after all, the first parsha talks about saras on your flesh. Shechin and mikveh are within that klal. In other words, saras of the flesh would include regular saras of the flesh, or saras from a burn, or saras from a bruise. In other words, you understand, shechin and mikveh were a davar shahaya bichlal, v'yotza min haklal. Now, here is the problem. Okay, maybe I'll hold it over. Okay, but we're going to discuss this, and one of the things we're going to have to look at is, after I go through this example, which is a bit complicated, we're going to ask, why can't I just apply the rules of what I just said? I mean, isn't this a regular case? Davar shaya bichlal, v'yatsa min haklal l'lamed, lo l'lamed al atzmo yatsa, elo lamed al kal kulo yatsa. Let me just tell you, in terms of orientation, that rule number 9 moves in the opposite direction. Rule number 8 said, whatever the repetition comes to teach me is going back on the klal. Rule number 9 is going to tell me, whatever it's coming to teach me is limited to the separated case and does not go back on the klal. So 8 and 9, and 10 and 11 as well, are all dealing with the same problem, but 8 says, whatever the repetition is teaching me goes back on the klal. 9, 10, and 11, which to be defined, are teaching me it does not go back on the klal. And it only applies to them, right? So we're going to have to, number 1, decipher the differences in the rules. And number 2, try to figure out why sometimes the methodology is it goes back on the klal. That's rule 8, midah number ches. And why in tes, yud, and yud aleph, it bedafka does not go back on the klal. Okay, so I hope that even just having this map in your head will help you. In other words, 8 goes back on the klal. 9, 10, 11 does not go back on the klal and is limited to the thing that was excluded. Okay, and Chazal will try to lay out when do you say this and when do you say that. Yeah.
What do you mean going back on the klal? What is that?
Going back on the klal means that the chiddush that the repetition is teaching me is a chiddush that goes back on all of the cases in the general, like by Shabbos. Right? That's what I mean, going back on the klal. Meaning you don't say the chiddush is only for that case. Right? That was ches. But in the other 3 rules, the chiddush will only be for that case and not teach me anything about the klal from which it was taken out. Okay, so the example we'll look at tomorrow is saras or basar compared to shechin and mikveh. Again, it's a very complicated example. You may want to look in the Chumash ahead to try to see this, but Mir Hashem, we'll cover it tomorrow.